Rain does not care who it falls on. That morning it soaked the fine silk of a duke's coat the same way it soaked the rags of a girl who had not eaten in 2 days. And on this grey morning in the northern capital, the rain would push these two strangers together, though neither of them could have guessed that the beggar girl feeding bread to a nobleman's horses carried a secret heavy enough to shake a kingdom. The market street was a river of noise. Fishwives shouted over baskets of grey mackerel, a chestnut seller blew on his cold hands, and the cobblestones ran slick with mud and rainwater. Wagons and handcarts jammed together, wheel against wheel, and no one moved an inch. Into this tangle came a black carriage, its lacquer gleaming despite the weather, pulled by 2 grey horses with silver buckles on their harness. Inside sat Julian, the young Duke of Ashfield. He was 25, tall, with dark hair pushed back from a serious face. He tapped one gloved finger against the window and frowned at the crowd. He was a full day's ride from home and wanted nothing more than to be through this wretched city before nightfall. Then the horses screamed. A cart had toppled somewhere ahead, and a barrel of apples came bouncing loose down the slope, crashing and rolling between the horses' legs. The greys reared, eyes rolling white, hooves striking sparks off the wet stones. The coachman hauled on the reins and cursed, but the animals were past listening. One more lurch and the carriage would tip, or the horses would bolt straight into the crowd of women. Before Julian could throw open the door, a small figure darted out from beneath the awning of a bread stall. She was a girl, perhaps 19, wrapped in a shawl so worn it had gone the color of ash. Her skirts were caked with mud to the knee, and her dark hair hung wet against her cheeks. In her thin hands she held a heel of black bread, the kind sold cheap at the end of market day, the kind a hungry person guards like gold. She did not run from the horses, she walked toward them. "There now," she said. Her voice was low and steady, and somehow it carried under all the shouting. "There now, my lovelies. All that fuss over a few apples." She broke the bread and held out her open palm. The nearest horse tossed its head, still wild, but she did not flinch or step back. She simply waited, hand out, murmuring the whole time in that calm, even way, as though she had all the time in the world and no fear in her at all. The horse's ears flicked forward. Slowly, snorting, it dropped its nose to her hand and took the bread. She stroked its wet neck, moved to the second horse, and offered the last of it there. Within a minute, both animals stood quiet, breathing hard but still, their panic melted clean away. The whole street had gone silent to watch. Julian sat frozen inside his carriage, one hand still on the door. He had seen grown grooms fail to calm a spooked pair. He had seen strong men trampled trying. And here was a girl who looked as though a strong wind might knock her down, and she had done it with a scrap of bread and a soft word. He stepped down into the rain. Up close she was thinner than he had thought, her wrists like reeds, her lips pale with cold. Yet when she turned to face him, she did not cower or beg or hold out her hand for a coin, as he half expected. She looked at him plainly, and there was something in the set of her shoulders, some quiet, unbending grace that did not belong in a muddy market at all. "You have a gift with horses," Julian said. "They only wanted someone to be still," she answered. "Everyone was shouting. Shouting never calmed anyone." He glanced at the breadcrumbs still on her palm. "That was your supper, I think." For the first time, her composure wavered, just slightly. She closed her hand. "It was nothing, my lord." It was not nothing. Julian studied her a moment longer. There was a puzzle here that he could not name. Her clothes were those of the lowest beggar, but her speech was clean and clear, with none of the rough burr of the capital slums. She held herself the way his own late mother had once held herself in the drawing-room, spine straight, chin level, hands folded. It made no sense, and he found he could not simply climb back into his carriage and drive away from it. "What is your name?" he asked.
"Clara, sir."
"And your family, Clara? Your home?"
Her eyes dropped to the wet stones. "I have neither, my lord. Not any more." The rain came down harder. Around them, the market slowly stirred back to life, carts creaking forward now that the apples had rolled away.
Julian made his decision quickly, the way he made most things. "I keep a country estate 2 days south of here, a large household. My housekeeper is always in want of steady hands, and steady is a thing you plainly have." He paused. "I can offer you honest work, a warm room, proper clothes, food that is yours to keep. It is dull work, mending, sorting cloth in the textile wing, but it is respectable, and no one will trouble you there." Clara lifted her gaze. Something flickered across her face. Hope, and beneath it, a flash of something more careful, almost like fear, as though a warm room and steady work were the last things in the world she had learned to trust. "Why?" she asked softly. "You do not know me at all." "No," Julian admitted, "but I know what I have just seen, and I have never been the sort of man who can watch a decent soul go hungry in the rain and drive on as though I saw nothing." For a long moment, she said nothing. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat and from the ends of her ragged shawl. Then she gave a small nod and a curtsy so smooth and correct that it startled him all over again. "Then I thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I will not give you cause to regret it." She could not have known, as she climbed up behind the coachman and the gray horses pulled them free of the crowded street, how those words would be tested. Nor could Julian have guessed that the ragged girl now riding toward his home carried, stitched into her very hands, a secret that half the kingdom believed had died years ago. The country lay open and green after the smoke of the capital, and by the time the carriage turned off the high road on the third day, Clara had almost forgotten what it was to breathe air that did not taste of coal. House Ashfield rose at the end of a long avenue of oaks. It was a great gray manor of honey-colored stone, softened by ivy, with tall windows that caught the low afternoon sun. Sheep dotted the far pasture, and somewhere beyond the walls a mill wheel turned slow and steady on a stream. To a girl who had slept the past year in doorways and beneath market stalls, it looked less like a house than a small kingdom of its own. The carriage rolled to a stop before the wide front steps, and a woman came out to meet it. She was perhaps 50, stout and neat, with iron-gray hair pinned tight beneath a white cap and a ring of keys at her waist that chimed as she walked. This was Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, and she had run the manor's household for more than 20 years. Julian stepped down and turned to hand Clara from her seat, a courtesy that made the coachman raise his brows and made Mrs. Hartley's eyes narrow ever so slightly. "Mrs. Hartley," Julian said, "this is Clara. She is to join the household. See that she is given proper clothes, a warm room of her own, and light work in the textile wing. Mending and sorting, nothing heavy. She has had a hard road of it." The housekeeper's gaze traveled over Clara's ruined skirts, the mud dried gray to the hem, the shawl worn to threads. 20 years of service had taught Mrs. Hartley to read a person in a single glance, and what she read here did not settle easily. The clothes said gutter. The girl inside them said something else entirely. For Clara had not shrunk under that hard look, but met it with a level calm that a duke's daughter might have envied. "As you say, Your Grace," Mrs. Lee answered, and if she had questions, she kept them behind her teeth. Julian gave Clara the smallest nod. "You are safe here," he said quietly. And then he was gone, up the steps and into the great house, called away by a steward with a ledger already open in his hands. Left alone with the housekeeper, Clara curtsied. It was the same smooth, correct dip she had given in the market, and it did not go unnoticed. "Well," said Mrs. Hartley, half to herself, "come along then." She led Clara through a side passage into the working heart of the house, a warren of stone corridors and busy rooms far from the grand front rooms. Clara was scrubbed, given a plain gray dress of good wool, a clean apron, sturdy shoes, and a small room under the eaves with a real bed and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. When she first sat upon that bed and felt the softness of it, she pressed a hand to her mouth and stayed very still for a long moment, and no one saw the shine in her eyes. By the next morning, she was set to work. The textile wing was a long, warm room lit by wide north windows where great baskets of household linen waited to be sorted, patched, and pressed. Here the maids mended torn sheets and frayed tablecloths, darned stockings by the dozen, and turned worn collars. It was quiet, patient work, and it suited Clara well, for she said almost nothing at all. That silence was the first thing the other servants remarked upon. "She's not simple," whispered a maid named Betsy to another over the linen baskets. "You can see she understands every word. She just doesn't waste any." The girls tried at first to draw her out. Where had she come from? Did she have a sweetheart? Was it true the master had found her in the road? Clara answered such questions with a soft word and a small smile, gave nothing away, and bent her head back to her work. In time they stopped asking, though they never stopped watching, for there was a great deal to watch. Clara's hands were the wonder of the wing. She threaded a needle without looking at it. She could judge the exact weight of a cloth by rubbing a corner between two fingers and sort a heaped basket into wools, linens, and silks faster than 3 girls working together. When she mended a tear, the stitches ran so fine and even that Betsy swore you needed to hold the cloth to the light to find the seam at all. "Where'd a beggar learn to sew like that?" Betsy asked one evening, turning over a napkin Clara had repaired. The mend was invisible. "My mother's a seamstress, and she can't do half so neat." No one had an answer, and Clara, if she heard, only reached for the next piece in the basket. Mrs. Hartley heard the talk, of course. Very little happened in her house that she did not hear. She said nothing to the girls, but she began to find small reasons to pass through the textile wing more often than her duties strictly required, and each time she paused at the door to watch the new girl work. It was more than the neatness of the stitches that troubled the housekeeper. It was the whole of her. Clara ate with her back straight and her elbows in. She never grabbed for the best seat by the fire, never gossiped, never once complained of the cold or the long hours. When she rose to fetch water for another maid, she did it as though offering a kindness, not performing a chore. She had the manners of a lady laid over the labor of a servant, and the two did not sit well together in Mrs. Hartley's mind. One gray afternoon, the housekeeper found Clara alone in the wing, pressing a linen sheet with a heavy flat iron warmed at the hearth. The girl worked in a pool of dim window light, her lips moving without sound, and Mrs. Hartley realized with a start that she was singing under her breath, a slow, sweet tune in a language the housekeeper did not know. It was not the rough patter of the capital streets. It was gentle and rolling, almost like a lullaby, and there was such quiet sorrow in it that Mrs. Hartley found she could not bring herself to interrupt. She stepped back into the corridor and let the girl sing. That night, sitting by her own small fire with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, Mrs. Hartley turned the puzzle over and over. A beggar who curtsied like a courtier, a pauper whose stitches shamed a trained seamstress, a slum girl who sang lullabies in a foreign tongue. Whoever the master had brought home from the capital, the old housekeeper thought as she banked her fire for the night, she was no ordinary serving girl. And somewhere, beneath all that mud and silence, there was a story waiting to be told. A week passed, and the household settled around Clara the way a stream settles around a stone, flowing on, but never quite forgetting she was there. On the 7th day, the weather turned kind. The rain that had followed them from the capital finally broke, and the great glass sunroom on the manor's south side filled with pale golden light. It was a beautiful room, all tall windows and potted orange trees, where the family had once taken breakfast in the warmer months. Julian used it now as a place to work when the ledgers grew tiresome, spreading his papers across the long table and letting the sun do what the fire could not. That morning, a small crisis had reached Mrs. Hartley. A formal tunic of the late Duke's, a fine thing of deep blue wool, worn now only for the most solemn occasions, had been found with a long tear down one sleeve, chewed, it was thought, by moths in the cedar press. It was too precious to discard and too damaged to send out, and the housekeeper wanted it mended by the steadiest hand in the house before Sunday. The steadiest hand in the house was Clara, so she was sent to the sunroom, where the light was best, with the ruined tunic folded over her arm and a small workbox in her hands. She did not know Julian was there. He sat at the far end of the long table, half hidden behind a screen of orange leaves, a column of figures before him, and his pen gone still in his fingers. He had meant to call out a greeting. Then he saw her settle by the window, spread the blue wool across her knees, and begin, and the greeting died unspoken in his throat. Clara studied the tear for a long moment, turning the sleeve to the light. Then she reached into the workbox and drew out not the plain gray thread a mend would need, but a spool of fine golden silk that Mrs. Hartley must have sent along by mistake. She held it up, hesitated, and then, with the smallest sigh, as though giving in to an old temptation, she threaded her needle with the gold. What followed, Julian could not look away from. She did not stitch the way the maids stitched. Her needle moved in a pattern he had never seen from any servant, dipping and rising in a rhythm too complex to follow, laying down thread upon thread in fine layers that built one atop the other. Her fingers flew, quick and certain, and she never once glanced down to check her progress. It was as though her hands already knew the shape they meant to make and needed no eyes to guide them. Slowly, out of the torn blue wool, a small figure began to grow. It was a sun, worked in raised gold with rays that seemed almost to turn as the light caught them. Around its center ran a border of tiny interlocking knots, each one no bigger than a grain of wheat, and within the disk she laid a pattern of layered rays that gave the whole thing a strange depth, so that it did not lie flat upon the cloth, but seemed to rise out of it, catching the morning light like something alive. Julian's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled off the table. He knew that crest. He knew it the way a man knows his own name. Every high-born child in the land had once been shown that emblem in their history books, the gold rising sun of the southern realm, the old sun kingdom that had stood proud beyond the mountains for 300 years before it crumbled and fell to ruin, its royal house scattered, its people driven north as refugees. Julian's own tutor had shown him a drawing of it as a boy and had told him something the boy had never forgotten, that the raised, layered sun could not be copied from a picture. The stitch that made it live was a guarded secret, passed by hand and by patience from mother to daughter within the walls of the southern court, taught to no one but the high-born ladies of the royal blood. Forgers had tried for a century to imitate it, and always failed, for the trick of the layered rays lived only in the fingers of those born to it. And here, in his own quiet sunroom, a beggar girl in a grey wool dress was working it without so much as looking at her hands. The pen finished rolling across the floor and struck the leg of a chair with a small click. Clara's head came up. For an instant, her eyes met his across the length of the room, and Julian saw the whole truth of it pass over her face in a single breath. First surprise, then a flash of pure alarm, sharp as a struck flint. And then, worst of all, a swift and practiced stillness came down over her features like a curtain, smoothing everything away, hiding whatever she truly felt behind that same calm mask she had worn in the market. Her hands moved almost of their own accord. Quick as thought, she folded the sleeve over the half-worked sun, hiding the gold beneath the blue, and she rose to her feet. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, Her voice was steady, but a shade too even, the way a voice goes when its owner is working very hard to keep it so. "I did not know the room was taken. I will find another place to work." "Sit down, Clara." He had not meant it to come out so quietly. She stopped where she stood, the tunic pressed to her chest, and did not sit. Julian rose from his own chair and crossed the sunroom slowly, giving her time, the way one approaches a horse that might yet bolt. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked, not at her frightened face, but at the small corner of gold that still showed at the edge of the folded cloth. "May I see your work?" he asked. For a long moment she did not move. Outside the tall windows, a blackbird sang in the orange trees, careless of everything. At last, because there was nothing else she could do, Clara let the folded sleeve fall open across her hands and held it out to him, and the little gold sun caught the light and shone. Julian looked down at it for a long time. He did not touch it. He did not need to. He had his answer, plain as day, worked in silk by a hand that had no business knowing how. "Where?" he said softly, and he found his own voice was none too steady either. "Did a girl found begging in the northern capital learn to stitch the royal sun of the fallen south?" Clara said nothing, but her hands, holding out the cloth, had begun very faintly to tremble, and in her downcast eyes there glittered the first bright warning of tears she was fighting hard not to shed. He did not press her there in the sunroom, with the whole household within earshot and the maids passing in the corridor beyond. Whatever this girl was, she had guarded her secret through cold and hunger and a year of doorways, and Julian understood that such a secret would not be coaxed out in the open. So he only said, gently, "Come to the library this evening, after the house is quiet. You have my word that no harm will come to you. I wish only to understand." And then he let her go. Clara worked out the rest of that long day like a woman moving through a dream, her hands doing their tasks while her mind ran far ahead of them. She could have fled. She had thought about it before, at the first sign of trouble in the capital, and she thought about it now. A bundle of bread, a stolen hour, the open road. But her feet had grown tired of running, and something in the Duke's quiet manner told her that this time, perhaps, she need not. So when the house had gone dark and still, and the last of the maids had climbed to their beds under the eaves, Clara wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and made her way down to the library. It was a grand room, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, and a fire burned low and warm in the great stone hearth. Julian stood beside it, and on the small table at his elbow lay an old volume, its cover cracked with age. He had been waiting. "Sit," he said, and gestured to the chair across from his own. "Please, you are not a servant tonight, Clara, whatever else you are. You are my guest." She sat, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, and the firelight played across a face that had lost its careful mask and looked, now, only very tired. Julian did not sit at once. He lifted the old book from the table and turned it so she could see. On the open page, drawn in faded ink, was a history of the Southern Court, its halls, its customs, and there in the corner, a careful sketch of the gold, rising sun. "I sent for this from the muniment room after I left you," he said. "I had to be certain I had not imagined it." He set it down where she could reach it. "The stitch you worked this morning cannot be learned from a drawing. My own tutor told me so when I was a boy. It passes only from the ladies of the Southern royal house to their daughters, hand to hand, behind palace walls. Forgers have chased it for 100 years and never caught it." He looked at her steadily. "I have watched a great many people in my life, Clara. I do not think you are a forger." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Clara lifted her head, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. The rough, flattened speech of the capital was gone. In its place came something clear and rounded and low, each word placed with a care that no serving girl had ever learned, the accent of a court, of tutors and lessons and marble halls. Hearing it, Julian felt the last of his doubt fall away, and the truth settled over the warm room like a held breath. "My mother taught me that stitch," Clara said softly, "in a garden that no longer exists. She said a lady's hands should always know how to make something beautiful, no matter what the world took from her." A sad smile touched her lips. She could not have known how right she would be. "Who are you?" Julian asked. "My name is Clara." She met his eyes without flinching now, as though setting down at last a weight she had carried too far and too long. "Princess Clara, of the House of the Southern Sun. Or I was, before there was no house left to belong to." Julian said nothing. He sat slowly in the chair across from her, and he listened. "I was young when the kingdom fell," she went on, her gaze drifting to the fire. "My father's realm had stood for 300 years, and then, in the space of a single hard winter, it was gone. The treasury empty, the great families fled, the court scattered like leaves. My mother died in the cold of that last year. My father did not long outlive her." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I was taken north by an old servant who had served our house since before I was born. She meant to carry me to distant kin who might shelter me, but she was old, and the road was cruel, and she died of a fever in a coaching inn 3 days from the capital. And after that, there was no one. There was only me." "You were a child," Julian said quietly. She said it simply, without asking for pity. "A lost princess is not a safe thing to be, Your Grace. There were men in the north who would have paid a great deal for a girl of royal southern blood, to marry her against her will and claim her title, or to hand her back across the mountains for a purse of gold. Or worse. A princess is a prize. So I stopped being one." She spread her thin hands, palms up, and looked at them. "I learned to speak like the streets. I let my clothes go to rags on purpose. I made myself small and grey and silent, because no one looks twice at a beggar, and a beggar no one wants is a beggar who stays alive. For 6 years it kept me safe." A faint, broken laugh. "Until this morning, when I could not help myself, and I reached for the gold thread." The fire popped and sent up a curl of sparks. Julian looked at the woman before him. The straight back, the tired eyes, the quiet dignity he had glimpsed in the market and finally understood, and he felt something in his chest turn over that he could not yet name. "All this time," he said, "you calmed my horses with bread you needed for yourself. You worked in silence and asked for nothing. And you were a princess." "I was a hungry girl in the rain," Clara answered. "The rest was only a name, and names do not keep out the cold." She looked up at him, and for the first time a real fear showed plainly in her face, not the guarded flicker of before, but something open and human. "You could gain a great deal by making my name known, Your Grace. Please, I have kept myself hidden for 6 years. I am asking you not to undo it." Julian leaned forward, and his answer, when it came, was without a moment's hesitation. "Clara," he said, "I brought you here to keep you safe. I did not know from what. Now that I do, I give you my word as plainly as I know how. Your secret is yours, and it will be kept. Not because you are a princess," he paused, "but because you trusted a stranger enough to tell him the truth." And in the firelight, Clara wept, quietly at last, the way a person weeps when a burden is finally shared. The days that followed were unlike any Clara had known in 6 long years. Julian kept his word, and more. He told no one, not Mrs. Hartley, not the steward, not a single soul, that the quiet mending girl in the textile wing was a princess of the fallen South. But he did quietly change a great many small things.
Clara was moved from the room under the eaves to a proper bedchamber in the family wing. Her grey wool dress was replaced with 2 fine gowns of soft muslin,
and her light duties were let go altogether, though the household was told only that the master had taken the girl on as a companion to help with his mother's old letters and papers, which drew a few raised brows but no real suspicion. The true change happened behind the library doors, in the quiet hours after supper. "You cannot stay hidden forever," Julian told her on the first evening. "One day the world may learn who you are, whether we wish it or no. When that day comes, you must be ready to meet it as a princess and not as a frightened girl in the rain. So I mean to help you remember what you were taught to be." And so the lessons began. They were unlike any lessons Clara had ever sat through, for there was nothing of the schoolroom in them. Julian did not lecture. He simply set out to remind her, piece by patient piece, of the world she had left behind. He laid a formal table, with all its bewildering ranks of glass and silver, and had her name each fork and spoon. He walked her the length of the long gallery with a book balanced upon her head, teaching her once more the slow, even glide of a lady crossing a ballroom. He drilled her in the proper forms of address, how one spoke to a baron and how differently to an earl, when to incline the head and when to hold it high. To his quiet astonishment, she needed only the smallest reminding. "You already know this," he said one evening, watching her sink into a curtsy so faultless it might have graced a coronation. "I am not teaching you. I am only knocking the dust off." "It was buried," Clara admitted, rising. "Not gone. I used to lie awake in the cold and go over it all in my head, the dances, the greetings, the order of the courses at a feast. It was a way of remembering my mother's voice." A small smile. "I never dreamed I would have use for any of it again." There was a warmth growing in those evenings that neither of them spoke of. Julian found reasons to make the lessons longer. Clara found her laughter coming back to her, a little more each night, a sound he discovered he waited for. When their hands brushed over a book, or she looked up and caught him watching her instead of the lesson, a silence would fall between them that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with 2 people who were, quietly, forgetting to be careful. The true test came on the 12th day. Julian had, some weeks before, agreed to host a formal dinner for the local gentry, a baron and his wife, a sharp-eyed dowager countess of considerable standing, and a handful of lesser families from the surrounding country. He could not now cancel it without causing talk, so he made a bold decision, and one that frightened Clara half out of her wits when he told her. "You will dine with us," he said, "not as a servant, as Miss Clara, a gentlewoman of distant southern family, come to stay as my mother's kinswoman's ward." He saw the fear rise in her face and pressed on gently. "It is the safest lie I can build, and it will be the truest test there is. If you can sit at that table and pass among them unremarked, then you need never fear the world again. And Clara, I will be beside you the whole while." The evening arrived. Clara came down the grand staircase in a gown of pale rose silk, her dark hair dressed high, and Julian, waiting at the foot of the stairs, quite forgot for a moment what he had meant to say to her. The dowager countess, arriving just behind him, did not fail to notice his expression, and filed it away behind her shrewd old eyes. The dinner was a gauntlet, and Clara walked it without a single stumble. She sat where she was placed, spine straight, and let the endless ranks of silver hold no terror for her. When the fish came, her hand found the right fork without hesitation. When the dowager countess, who missed nothing and forgave less, tried to trip her with a sly question about the customs of the far south, Clara answered with such easy, graceful knowledge, speaking of southern gardens and southern songs, as one who had merely read of them, that the old woman sat back, disarmed, and looked at her with new and genuine interest. "You have fine manners for a girl raised so far from any court, my dear," the Countess remarked over the sweet course, her eyes narrow and bright.
"My guardian was very strict, my lady," Clara answered smoothly, "and I had little to do but learn."
The dowager's gaze slid, just for a moment, to Julian at the head of the table, and then back. "Strict and thorough. You are a credit to whoever shaped you." Down the length of the candlelit table, Julian watched Clara turn to answer the Baron's wife, watched her laugh at some small pleasantry, watched the whole gathering warm to her without the least idea of the storms she had survived to sit among them. And he understood, with a quiet certainty that startled him, that his interest in her had long since stopped being the concern of a protector. It was her mind that had caught him first, the quickness of it, the way she read a room in a glance. Then it was her courage, the iron beneath the softness, a girl of 13 who had chosen to become invisible rather than be sold. And now, seeing her shine in a room that would have crushed a lesser soul, he found the last of his guard fall away entirely. When the guests had gone and the candles burned low, he found her in the drawing room, standing by the dark window, letting out a long breath as though she had held it all evening. "You were magnificent," he said. She turned, and the polished gentlewoman of the dinner table was gone. There was only Clara, tired and shining and real. "I was terrified the entire time. No one would ever have guessed it. I had a reason not to fail." She said it lightly, but her eyes did not leave his, and the room grew very quiet. Julian crossed to stand near her at the window. He did not touch her. He only looked at her for a long moment in the low candlelight, at this woman who had come to him a beggar and turned out to be a queen in all but crown, and he felt the words rising in him that he was not yet brave enough to say. "Clara," he began, but a knock came at the door, a footman with a message, and the moments slipped away between them, unspoken, but no longer unfelt. For 3 days after the dinner, Clara walked the halls of House Ashfield lighter than she had in years. She had faced a room full of watching eyes and passed through it whole. For the first time since a cold winter had taken everything from her, she began to let herself believe that the running was truly over. It was Julian who suggested to town. "There is a great market at Wetherby, 2 hours' ride," he said over breakfast. "The autumn silk fair. Fine cloth comes up from all over the country, and some from further still. You worked so long with poor grey wool. I should like to see you choose something worthy of your hand." He smiled. "Consider it a reward for surviving the Countess." Clara laughed and agreed, and thought nothing of the danger in it. Why should she? She had walked 100 markets in her rags and never been seen. She had forgotten, in the warmth of those safe weeks, that she no longer looked like a beggar at all. The market town of Wetherby was a cheerful crush of noise and colour. The silk fair had drawn traders from every corner of the land, and the square was a sea of striped awnings, bolts of cloth stacked shoulder-high, and merchants crying their wares. Clara moved among it all on Julian's arm in a gown of deep green, a fine handkerchief tucked at her wrist, and she felt not fear now, but a bright, unfamiliar joy, the simple pleasure of a fair day, a companion she trusted, and no reason on earth to be afraid. They stopped at a stall heaped with silks, and while Julian debated the merits of a blue against a grey with the stall-keeper, Clara drew out her handkerchief to wipe a smudge of dust from her glove. It was a small thing, that handkerchief. She had stitched it herself in an idle hour, taking a quiet pleasure in the work now that she no longer had to hide her skill from Mrs. Hartley. Along one corner, without quite meaning to, she had worked a delicate border, and at the heart of it, small and half hidden in the folds, a tiny rising sun in gold. She had thought nothing of it. Here, 2 hours from home, among strangers, who would ever look twice at a lady's handkerchief? But 3 stalls down, a group of traders had come up from the far south that season, driven north by hard times to sell what they could. They were older men, weathered, with the dark coloring and rolling speech of the southern territories, and they carried in their memories the whole world that Clara had lost.
They had seen the old kingdom in its glory. They had sold cloth to its court. And one among them, a gray-bearded merchant named Alaric, had once, as a young man, delivered bolts of silk to the very ladies of the royal household. It was Alaric who saw the handkerchief. He had been idly watching the well-dressed pair at the silk stall, as a merchant watches anyone who might be a customer.
Then the young woman lifted her hand, and a corner of white cloth caught the light, and upon it he saw a flash of gold that stopped the breath in his chest. He knew that sun. Not the rough copy that hawkers sometimes peddled to the sentimental, but the true crest, raised, layered, alive, the rays seeming almost to turn as the cloth moved. He had seen it perhaps a dozen times in his long life, and only ever upon the persons of the highest ladies of the fallen court. No forger had ever caught it. No pretender had ever worn it. To make that stitch, a woman had to have been taught it by the royal blood itself. Alaric's mouth went dry. He touched the arm of the man beside him. "Bardo," he said, very low. "The lady at the silk stall. Look at her hand, the cloth." Bardo looked and frowned and did not understand. "A pretty handkerchief? What of it?" "The sun." Alaric's voice had gone rough. "Look at the sun." The younger man looked again, and this time he saw it, and his frown fell away into open astonishment. "It cannot be. That stitch died with the court. Everyone knows it." "I sold silk to the ladies who worked it," Alaric said. "With my own eyes I watched the young princesses learn it at their mother's knee. I would know that hand among 10,000. He stared at the woman in green, at her fine bearing, at the dark hair and the calm, careful way she held herself, and an old memory stirred and rose in him like something surfacing from deep water. There was a child, the youngest, lost on the northern road when the kingdom fell, they said. He drew a slow breath. The two men stood frozen among the bustle of the fair, staring at a young woman who had no idea she was being watched. Across the square, Clara tucked her handkerchief away, quite unaware, and turned to smile at something Julian had said. The blue silk or the gray, such was the whole of her concern in that bright, careless moment. She chose the blue. Julian paid the stall-keeper, and the two of them moved on into the crowd, arm in arm, toward a stall of ribbons that had caught her eye. Alaric watched them go until the crowd swallowed them up. "Say nothing," he warned Bardo quietly. "Not here. But mark the gentleman she walks with. I know his face. That is the young Duke of Ashfield. His estate lies but 2 hours south." He stroked his grey beard, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite greed and not quite pity, but a merchant's swift calculation of how the world had suddenly changed. "If the lost princess of the south is alive," he said slowly, "and living under a duke's roof in the north, then there are men who have hunted that news for 6 years and would pay a king's ransom to hear it." Bardo's eyes widened. "You mean to tell them?" "I mean," said Alaric, "that a thing like this cannot be kept. Word of it will run whether we speak or no. Such things always do." He turned back to his own stall, but his hands, packing away his bolts of cloth, had a new haste in them. A secret this size does not stay a secret long, and when it breaks, it will not break gently. 2 hours to the south, unknowing, Clara laughed at a stall of ribbons and let Julian tie a length of pale blue at her wrist, happier in that moment than she had been in all her life, while behind her, quietly, the door she thought she had closed forever swung open once again. Word ran, just as Alaric had said it would. It ran the way fire runs through dry grass, from a whisper at the silk fair to a rumour in a coaching inn, from a servant's gossip to a lord's dinner table, growing and changing with every mouth it passed through, until within a fortnight it had reached the ear of a man it should never have reached at all. His name was Lord Reginald Blackmore,
Duke of Harrogate, and his estate lay a day's ride to the east. He was a man of great wealth and greater ambition, some 15 years Clara's senior, with a hard, handsome face and a name that had grown old and grand without ever growing loved.
The Blackmores had money enough to buy a county, but they had come by their title through trade and marriage rather than ancient blood, and this was a wound that Lord Reginald had carried all his life. He wanted, above all things, to be counted among the truly great houses, and a match with genuine royalty, even fallen, even foreign, would do in a single stroke what 3 generations of Blackmore gold had failed to do. So when the rumor reached him that a lost princess of the Southern Sun Kingdom was alive and living under the roof of the young Duke of Ashfield, Lord Reginald did not hesitate. He ordered his finest carriage made ready, put on his most splendid coat, and set out for House Ashfield to claim the prize before any other man could reach it. He arrived on the 18th day, unannounced. Julian was in the drawing-room with Clara when the footman brought word, and the name made him set down his cup with a slow care that Clara at once understood to mean trouble. "Blackmore," Julian said quietly. "Here." He looked at her, and she saw the same thought pass behind his eyes that had leapt into her own. "Go up to your room, Clara. Let me learn what he wants." But it was already too late. Lord Reginald did not wait to be received. He swept into the drawing-room on the footman's heels, filling the doorway with his fine coat and his colder smile, and his eyes went straight to Clara and fixed there with the frank, appraising look of a man inspecting a horse he means to buy. "So," he said, "the rumors are true." Julian rose at once and stepped between them, smooth and cold. "Lord Harrogate, you come into my house without invitation and stare at my guest without introduction. I confess I had heard your manners were poor. I did not know they were absent altogether." The insult glanced off Lord Reginald like rain off stone. "Spare me, Ashfield." His gaze slid past Julian to Clara, who had risen and now stood very still, her face gone pale but her chin held level. "All the North is whispering of it. The lost daughter of the Southern Crown, alive and sheltering here. I have come to see her for myself." He inclined his head to Clara in a bow that was more mockery than courtesy. "Your Highness, Reginald Blackmore, Duke of Harrogate, at your service, and, I hope, soon to be a good deal more than that." Clara said nothing. 6 years of hiding had taught her when silence was a shield. "Say plainly what you have come to say," Julian said, "and then leave my house." "Very well, plainly." Lord Reginald turned to face him fully and dropped all pretense of charm. "I have come to court the princess and to marry her. My house is richer than yours, Ashfield, richer than any in the North, and my offer is one that no sensible guardian would refuse on her behalf. A princess without a kingdom is a candle without a flame, a fine thing, but of no use to anyone. I can give her back what she lost: standing, position, a great house at her back, and my name to shield her." His smile returned, thin as a blade. "She will have every comfort, and in return, my line will have the royal blood it has wanted these 100 years. It is a fair bargain. I mean to conclude it." "You speak of her," Julian said, very low, "as though she were a bolt of cloth to be purchased at market." "I speak of her as the world speaks of her," Lord Reginald returned. "You may dress it in prettier words if it pleases you, but that is what a princess is, Ashfield, a title with a face. I merely have the honesty to say so, and the gold to act on it." He looked again at Clara. "The lady may speak for herself, surely. Well, madam, I offer you back everything the world took from you: wealth, rank, safety, a name that will silence every whisper. What has this young duke offered you but a servant's room and a mending basket? Come, be sensible."
For a long moment, Clara did not answer. She looked at this hard, splendid man who spoke of shielding her and meant only to spend her. And she felt the old, cold fear close around her heart, the very fear that had driven her into rags 6 years ago. This was the thing she had run from. This was why she had made herself small and gray and silent.
Not the hunger, not the cold, but this. The certainty that the moment her name was known, she would cease to be a person and become a prize, to be won and claimed and owned by the man with the deepest purse. And she understood with a sinking heart that a refusal would not be so simple as a word. Lord Reginald was powerful. He would not be turned aside by a quiet no. He would press and pressure and bring the weight of his rank and his gold to bear upon Julian's household until refusing him cost more than agreeing.
She began, and found her voice unsteady and hated it. My lord, I have no wish to marry. I wish only to live quietly. I am grateful for your—
Grateful. Lord Reginald smiled, unmoved. Gratitude is very well, but you will find, Your Highness, that a woman in your position has fewer choices than she imagines. There are men across the mountains who would pay dearly to have you back, and not gently. Others here who would use your name for far worse than marriage. Against such wolves, I am the kindest door open to you. Refuse me, and you may find the alternatives are not doors you would choose. He let the words hang, soft as a threat wrapped in silk. I shall return in 2 days for your answer. I trust the household will use the time to counsel the lady wisely. He bowed once more, turned, and swept from the room as grandly as he had entered, leaving a cold silence behind him.
Clara sank into a chair, her legs no longer willing to hold her, and pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Everything she had feared had come to pass. The door she thought closed had not merely opened. A wolf had walked through it. Julian crossed to her at once and knelt by her chair, and his face, when she looked at him, was not cold now, but fierce with something that had nothing to do with duty at all. He will not have you, Julian said. I swear it to you, Clara, whatever it costs. He will not have you. 2 days. That was all the time Lord Reginald had left them, and both days passed under its shadow like a house waiting for a storm to break. Clara barely slept. She sat long hours at her window, watching the eastern road, half expecting the great Blackmore carriage to come rolling back before its time. The fear that had driven her into rags 6 years ago had found her again, and it was worse now than it had ever been in the cold, because now she had something to lose. In the doorways of the capital, she had owned nothing but her own life. Here she had come to own a hope, a home, and a feeling she had not dared to name, and the thought of Lord Reginald's cold hands closing over all of it made her heart sick. Julian, for his part, spent those 2 days in a fury of quiet motion. He wrote letters, he sent riders, he turned over in his mind every law, every custom, every ally who might stand against a duke as rich and ruthless as Harrogate. But beneath all his planning ran a deeper current that no letter could address, and by the evening of the 2nd day, it had grown too strong to hold back. He found Clara in the rose garden at twilight. It was the loveliest corner of the whole estate, a walled garden where his mother had planted roses long ago, and though the autumn had thinned the blooms, a few late roses still glowed pale in the fading light. The sky above the western wall had turned to soft banks of rose and gold, and the first cool stars were pricking through. Clara stood among the flowers, with her shawl drawn close, looking out at nothing, and she did not hear him come. I thought I might find you here, Julian said softly. She turned. In the dying light, her face was pale and drawn, and the sight of it caught at him. I keep thinking I should run, she said before he could speak.
It is what I have always done. When the danger comes too near, you make yourself small, and you disappear, and you live." She gave a small, broken laugh. "But I do not want to disappear anymore. I have grown too fond of being seen. And I do not know how to be brave, only how to be gone." "Then do not be gone," Julian said. "Be brave, and let me be brave beside you." Something in his voice made her go still.
He crossed the garden to stand before her, close enough now that she had to lift her face to his, and whatever careful words he had planned deserted him all at once, and there was nothing left but the truth. "Clara, I have kept a distance between us these many weeks that I no longer wish to keep. I told myself I was your protector, and that a protector has no right to speak of his own heart. I told myself a great many sensible things." He drew a breath. "They were all lies. I did not offer you a place in my house because you were a princess. I did not fight to keep you from Blackmore because it was my duty. I did it because somewhere between a rainy market and a firelit library, I fell in love with you. And I have been falling further every day since, and I can no longer pretend otherwise." Clara's breath caught. She stared up at him, and the fear that had ruled her face for 2 days wavered and began, slowly, to break apart.
"You cannot," she whispered. "Julian, think what you are saying. Lord Reginald is right about one thing at least. A princess is a title with a face. Marry me, and you take on every enemy I have. The men across the mountains, the wolves who would use my name. I bring you nothing but danger and a crown that no longer exists. You could have any lady in the north with none of the risk. Why would you?" "Because I do not want any lady in the north." He took her cold hands in his. "I want the woman who calmed my horses with the last bread she had. I want the woman who worked in silence and asked for nothing, who survived 6 years of a cruel world and came out of it gentle instead of hard. I do not love a princess, Clara. I never met the princess until a week ago." His thumb moved gently over her knuckles. "I fell in love with the girl in the rain, long before I knew she wore a crown. The title changes nothing. It never did." The last of Clara's guard fell away, and with it, the last of her fear. For 6 years she had believed that her name was a curse, that to be known was to be claimed, that the truth of who she was could only ever be a thing men wanted to own. Lord Reginald had come and proven it all over again. And now, here stood a man who knew exactly what she was, who understood every danger it carried, and who was not reaching to take her title, but simply, quietly, offering her his heart in the ruin of a rose garden with nothing to gain and everything to risk. She had spent her whole hidden life waiting to be wanted for what she owned. She had never once let herself imagine being loved for who she was.
"I have been so afraid,"
she said, and the tears came now, but they were not the tears of the frightened girl at the window.
"Afraid that if anyone ever truly saw me, they would only see the crown. And you saw me first. You saw me when I was nothing at all."
Her fingers tightened around his.
"Julian, I feel it too. I have felt it for weeks, and I have been too frightened to name it, because everything I have ever loved has been taken from me."
She drew a shaking breath and lifted her chin, and in that moment she was neither beggar nor princess, but only Clara, choosing for herself.
"I love you, not the Duke who could shield me, you. And I will not run, not from Blackmore, not from anything. If you will stand with me, I will stand and be seen."
Julian lifted her hands and pressed them to his heart. "I will stand with you," he said, "against Blackmore, against the men beyond the mountains, against the whole world if it comes to that. You will never again face the cold alone. That I swear to you, Clara, not as your protector,
but as a man who loves you." Above the garden wall, the sky had deepened to violet, and the first stars burned clear and bright over the roses. Clara looked up at the man who had found her in the rain and offered her a home before he knew her worth. And for the first time in 6 long years, the fear was gone from her heart, and in its place was something she had thought lost forever: hope. And with it, a courage she had not known she still possessed. "Then let him come," she said softly. "Let all of them come. I am done hiding." When Lord Reginald's carriage came rolling up the eastern road on the morning it was due, it found the gates of House Ashfield shut against it, and a message waiting at the lodge. The lady had given her answer, the note read, and her answer was no. Any further suit was to be addressed not to a private household, but to the High Court in the capital, where the lady would shortly present herself in person. It was a bold stroke, and Julian's own doing. He had seen at once that hiding Clara any longer would only leave her forever at the mercy of the next Lord Reginald, and the one after him. A secret could be bought, threatened, dragged into the light against her will. But a truth spoken openly before the whole court, with all the nobility as witness, could never again be used as a weapon against her. The only way to make Clara safe was to make her known, not in whispers, but in daylight, on her own terms. So they went to the capital. The grand ballroom of the Capitol Palace had not seen such a gathering in years. Word had spread that the young Duke of Ashfield was to present a matter of great moment before the assembled High Court, and curiosity had drawn every noble house in the land. Beneath a ceiling painted with gods and clouds, under the blaze of 1,000 candles in their crystal chandeliers, the great and the grand of the realm stood in their silks and their jewels, and waited to see what the quiet Duke could possibly have to show them. At the appointed hour, the doors opened, and Julian entered with Clara upon his arm. She wore a gown of deep gold silk, the color of a rising sun, and her dark hair was dressed high and crowned with a simple circlet. She had worked the gown's embroidery herself in the long nights before they came. A border of the raised, layered sun running along the hem and sleeves, the true royal stitch, worked openly now for all the world to see. She did not walk as a servant, nor as a frightened girl hiding in rags. She walked the length of that great ballroom with her chin level and her shoulders straight, the slow, even glide of a lady who has known such rooms all her life, and a hush fell over the whole gathering as she passed. At the head of the hall, Julian stopped and turned to face the assembled court, and Clara stood beside him. "My lords and ladies," he said, and his voice carried clear to the farthest corner of the room, "I have brought before you today a truth that has been hidden for 6 long years, and I ask you to receive it as I have, with honor and with reverence." He paused, and the silence stretched taut. 6 years ago, when the great Sun Kingdom of the South fell into ruin, its royal house was scattered and lost. The world believed that the youngest daughter of that house had perished on the northern road. The world was wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. "She did not perish," Julian went on. "She survived. Alone she made her way north and hid herself among the lowest of the low, in rags and in silence, for 6 years, so that the wolves who would have used her might never find her. I found her by chance, feeding my horses with the last bread she had in a rainy market, asking nothing of anyone." He turned to Clara, and his voice gentled. "My lords and ladies, it is my honor beyond all honors to present to you Her Royal Highness, the Princess Clara of the House of the Southern Sun." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, near the front of the hall, an old woman in gray silk stepped forward, the Dowager Countess who had dined at Ashfield
and tried so hard to trip the quiet gentlewoman at her table. She had spent the weeks since turning that dinner over in her shrewd old mind, and now she looked long at the gold sun worked upon Clara's gown, and at the bearing of the woman who wore it, and something in her hard old face softened into wonder. Slowly, with the stiff grace of her years, the Dowager Countess sank into a deep and reverent curtsy. "Your Highness," she said, clear and firm, so that all the hall could hear her. And that was all it took. One by one, then in a great rustling wave of silk and velvet, the whole assembled court followed her down. Lords bowing, ladies curtsying, 1,000 candles blazing above a sea of nobility bent in homage to the beggar girl from the northern reign. Somewhere in the crowd, a group of gray-bearded southern merchants who had come north for a silk fair and stayed for this, stood with tears standing in their old eyes, for they had known the kingdom that was lost, and now they saw a piece of it restored. Clara stood at the head of that great hall and looked out over the bowed heads of the people who, only weeks before, would have counted her beneath their notice. For 6 years she had made herself invisible, so that no one would ever see the crown. Now the whole court knelt before it, and she felt no fear at all, only a deep, quiet steadiness, as though something long broken had finally been set right. Lord Reginald of Harrowgate was somewhere in that hall too, his splendid coat and his cold ambition lost among the crowd. Whatever he had planned, whatever gold and pressure he had meant to bring to bear, it was worth nothing now. He could not threaten a secret that the whole court had witnessed. He could not claim a princess who had claimed herself. His moment had passed, and he knew it, and he slipped from the ballroom without a word, and House Ashfield never troubled itself with him again. When at last the court rose, Julian took Clara's hand, and before them all he made his second announcement of the day. "There is one thing more," he said, and now there was a warmth in his voice that no formal occasion could hide. "The Princess Clara has done me the very great honor of accepting my hand. With the blessing of this court, we are to be betrothed." The hall broke into glad applause, and this time it was not homage but joy, the honest gladness of a room that loves a happy ending. Clara turned to Julian, and in the blaze of 1,000 candles, with the whole world watching and no longer any reason to hide, she smiled up at him without a trace of fear. She was no longer a beggar in the rain, guarding her supper and her secret. She was no longer a refugee hiding in rags, making herself small so that she might live. She was Princess Clara of the Southern Sun, betrothed to a man who had loved her before he ever knew her worth, restored to her name, restored to the light, and, for the first time since a cold winter had taken everything, entirely and truly safe. Outside the palace windows, the autumn sun rose gold and clear over the capital, and it looked, to those who cared to notice, very like the rising sun she wore upon her gown.